Hello, my name's Charlotte Goodwin, and today I'm going to read you the second chapter of my debut novel, The General's Son. Hopefully, you've already listened to the first chapter, but if you haven't, there's a chance to catch up on all the chapters I've read today on my YouTube channel, The Gallantrian Legacy. Okay, right, I'm going to start my chapter now, and I hope you enjoy it. So, the location is the Vaughan Military Training Academy, which is in Tannel on Fantasia, which is codenamed Planet M69245. The rain had been weeping from the sky all day like teardrops, crying on the sodden ground in a never-ending sob. A northerly wind brought a stinging chill. It came from the frozen wastelands of Geschlamp. It washed over the Takatooth Mountains and dusted the peaks with snow. It danced towards the south and sang over the Serian Sea, where the worst of its bite was softened by the warm, watery mass. On the military training grounds, high above the shore, recruit Garrad Bramson shivered. The sea-toned breeze found its way through his oiled cloak, through his sodden jacket and his soggy shirt, through his woolen vest and his thin layer of fat. He was freezing and desperate to fight. The music of metal on metal chimed through the air as recruit danced with recruit. After weeks of marching, running, climbing obstacles, and horsemanship, they had finally been issued with swords. It was time to show the instructors what they could do. They were blunt training swords, but a sword was a sword, and even as Garrad's soaked hand chilled to ice in the freezing rain, he still gripped the hilt. It just felt good to hold it. He watched with failing interest as two of the recruits were desperately attempting to show off their meagre skills with the blade. The fight was going on too long. The pair were evenly matched, and neither one was able to find their mark. Garrad watched with disdain. They were even, perhaps, but equally crap. One waved his sword, and the other parried. One dodged to the side, the other missed. A feint, a swerve. To the untrained observer, it looked impressive. The other recruits watched with excitement and cheered on the two young men. Garrad was unimpressed. It came to an end at last. Exhaustion eventually took one more than the other, and the fitter of the two took his chance. A tap on the arm with his blunt blade signalled his win. He patted his opponent on the shoulder and retreated to the sidelines as the other recruits cheered. "Bramston and Hendrill!" The instructor yelled out the names of the next two who were due to fight. At last, it was Garrad's turn. He took off his cloak and handed it to a fellow recruit, Mervyn, for safekeeping. "Don't worry, Mervyn, you won't be holding it for long," Garrad said with a wink. Mervyn shook his head and smirked. Garrad was not a short lad. He was already taller than his father. Although at 16 years old, he still had growing yet to do. Hendrill was even bigger, and broader. He was older, 18 or 19. Many of the other young men would have been intimidated. Not Garrad. His father had been in the army and had taught him to fight. Garrad was desperate to learn as soon as he realised a stick could be used as a pretend sword. He'd been given a wooden one when he was 6, and the training started then. By 10 years old, he could sometimes outmaneuver his ageing father, who was slowing down with the years. By 14, he almost always beat him. His feet were barely in the sparring ring when Hendrill launched at him. He hadn't waited for the call to start, but it didn't matter to Garrad. He dodged with ease. His opponent stumbled out over the chalky line boundary. The corporal instructor blew a whistle. "Let's call that a false start, shall we? Back in the ring." "Hendrill, this time, wait for my signal." "Yes, corporal," the bigger boy bellowed. Garrad nodded and held his sword ready. The whistle blew. Hendrill launched himself forward. Garrad was as fast as lightning. He dodged, spun, and landed a tap on his opponent's behind. There was no whistle. Perhaps the instructor hadn't seen. Regardless, he was ready to keep going. Hendrill whipped round. He swung his rapier with enough power to break a limb. Garrad barely needed to clash his steel to deflect the blow. He manoeuvred himself with such skill that force was barely necessary. He made sure his sword was in the right place to slide his opponent's blade to where he wanted it. With a flick of his arm, he forced the sword to one side. Hendrill's own momentum unbalanced him, and he stumbled. His foot went outside the ring. Garrad slapped him again with the flat of his blade, this time against the back of his shoulder. The whistle blew. Garrad had won. Hendrill stormed towards the crowd of spectators, splashing muddy water over the cobbles as he went. A wide grin swept across Garrad's face as he strutted back towards Mervyn. "Show off," His friend landed a heavy slap on Garrad's back. "Thanks," Garrad replied, swiping his cloak from Mervyn. "You shouldn't have done that," someone whispered from behind him. Garrad spun to see another of the young recruits, Wilf, a young man with the lanky, stunted form of a kid who was years his junior. He'd struggled in the early days, but Garrad helped him through, and he was now one of the few recruits Garrad could call a friend. "Why?" he said, puzzled. "Hendrel is a Corporal Ludwin's cousin. They've been training together. Hendrel was supposed to win. You humiliated him." "So? I was a better swordsman." "Sure, everyone knows that. But it won't win you any prizes. Not here. Not in training." "What are you on about, Wilf? The best students get recommendations. They get rapid promotions. If we do well here, we can be lance corporals in a year. My father always taught me to do my best. He said to make sure everyone knows how good I am. He said—" He paused in the face of Wilf's rising eyebrows. "What? Your father wasn't in the army, right?" "Yeah? When?" "I don't know. Years ago. Before I was born." "And what rank did he make?" "He left as a lance corporal. His own father needed him to help with the family business. He learned to be an awesome sword fighter, though. Not so much when he was in the army, but after. He led security on my grandfather's ships. He drilled the sailors every day in swordcraft. He was determined they'd not be victims to pirates, and he—" "Yeah, as I thought," Wilf cut him off. "What are you on about? I'm sure your father meant well, but it doesn't sound like he was a natural like you. Sounds like he trained hard to be good with the sword, and he wasn't the one who shone. He left as a lance corporal. If he was amazing, do you not think he'd have stayed longer?" Garrad was starting to get irritated at the apparent slight to his father. "Look, if you shine around here without permission, someone will notice, and they won't like it. You see, only those who—" "Bramston!" Corporal Ludwin bellowed across the training yard. Garrad snapped to attention. "Yes, Corporal," he called back. "Ring, now!" "Yes, Corporal." The instructor stood in the ring, cloak off and sword in hand. It was clear what he had in mind. Garrad puffed out his chest and raised his head as he walked to meet him. Rain was dripping off his nose as he went, but he was suddenly oblivious to the cold. The rest of the recruits cheered as he stepped into the ring. Corporal Ludwin had his whistle in his mouth. He blew it, spat it out, and raised his sword above his head. Garrad planted his feet and stood ready. Ludwin swung down, hard and fast. He was quick, faster than Garrad expected. He still managed to dodge in time. He ducked, spun, and whipped his sword round with both hands on the hilt. He used all the force and speed he could muster. He wasn't quick enough. The corporal caught his blow and pushed him back. Ludwin was shorter than Garrad, but broader. He was in his 20s and had filled out. Years of sword practice had given him a strength Garrad couldn't hope to match. Garrad had beaten his father as a boy, so he knew how strength could be used to his advantage, but only when you were ready. But the power of Ludwin's parry was too much for the light stance Garrad had chosen. He was pushed back too fast and with too much force to steady himself. He stumbled, fell, splashing into a muddy puddle as Ludwin swung another blow. Instinct brought his blade to bear. With his back still on the ground, Garrad parried and rolled in one smooth motion. He flipped onto his feet, found his strength, and forced a pirouette, sword slicing in a graceful arc towards his foe. The corporal took the power of the blow hard, his steel and brute force blocking with speed, but it was not without cost. His leg stumbled back to steady himself, foot spraying water as he went, failing to find the traction he'd hoped for, slipping, staggering. One hand slid from his sword as he tried to keep his balance, and terror flashed across his face for a fleeting moment before he found his footing. With a steady stance, he lurched to grip his sword, quick, but not quick enough. Garrad's sword flew through the air. Zipping past Ludwin's floundering blade, it slid round his opponent's attempt to block and found his arching chest as he desperately tried to avoid the unstoppable swing. It thudded hard into his side as it found its mark. Ludwin called out in pain. The crowd of recruits cheered. Garrad turned to face the crowd, arms raised high above his head, sword pointing at the weeping clouds, mouth stretching into a boyish grin, which widened as he heard Corporal Ludwin clamber to his feet behind him, growling and cursing as he rose. Ludwin! Came a deep, throaty roar across the training ground. Everyone went quiet. Garrad spun on the spot to see his instructor behind him, desperately trying to sheathe his sword. The crowd parted and Colour Sergeant Fornian stormed through the audience of recruits. The corporal grimaced as he lowered his sword and turned slowly. "Corporal! My office! Now!" the Colour Sergeant growled. Ludwin snapped to attention. "Yes, Colour!" He marched off, chest puffed out and stony-faced. Colour Fornian watched the corporal leave. He wiped the rain from his face and turned to Garrad. "What's your name, recruit?" Garrad straightened at once. He rarely spoke to anyone more senior than a corporal. "Bramston! Garrad Bramston, Colour!" he barked with nervous haste. "You did well today, lad. I was watching you fight the corporal. He's not a bad swordsman. One of the best we have, in fact. And you had him. How old are you?" 16, Colour." "Did your father serve?" "Yes, Colour. He taught me to fight." "He taught you well. Keep it up, lad. With skills like that, you'll go far." "Yes, Colour." Colour Sergeant Fornian did an about-turn and marched back the way he'd come, as if he couldn't help doing drill. "Corporal, stand!" he yelled as he went. "Yes, Colour," someone answered from the crowd. "Take over from Corporal Ludwin, if you please." "Yes, Colour." "It was good to finally get our hands on a sword, don't you think?" Garrad said to Mervyn as he shoved the door of the barracks block open with the hard whack of his palm. "Yeah, it was. Feels like we're actually proper soldiers now we have one of these on our hips." Mervyn patted the scabbard belted to his waist. "Even if it's just a training sword. I do miss the rapier my father gave me. It's not ornamental, but it's bloody well balanced and it handles lovely. This thing does the job for training, but I'm not sure it's the same." "I'm sure you'll be allowed it once we pass out as soldiers. It's only a few more months to the summer. Then we get to wield these things for real." They headed to the bed spaces in the long room, where bed after bed was set against each opposing wall. Their entire platoon lived in this block. They'd finished their evening meal and had been knocked off for the day. The recruits were filtering in, some limping or groaning in pain as they sauntered towards their beds. One or two had taken a hit during sword practice today. No blood was drawn, but there were plenty of large bruises. Garrad unstrapped his sword and placed it carefully in the rack above his bed, taking a seat on the mattress. "Mervyn," he began, "you never told me why Corporal Ludwin was called away. Did I miss something?" "Oh shit, yeah, I forgot to say. Think he's gonna get it." "What for?" "After you clobbered him and won the round, the arsehole got back to his feet as you faced the crowd. He swung his sword in the air and looked like he was about to whack you with it. Thing is, Colour Fornian was watching the whole time. He had a cloak on and was standing at the back somewhere, trying not to be noticed. Seeing how well we all did, I guess. When Ludwin was about to hit you, he called time and told him to go to his office." "Shit. I guessed he was just maybe getting pulled for sparring with a recruit." "Not sure there's any rules against that one as such, but if he'd clobbered you from behind..." Mervyn let the sentence trail. "Fuck. Good job Colour was there then, I guess." Garrad began his evening routine of cleaning and preparing his kit for the next day as the other recruits continued to file in from dinner. Hendril stalked past the end of Garrad's bed. Garrad was expecting a comment, some insult, or at least a scowl, but the man barely gave him a second glance. Maybe he'd learnt his lesson. Maybe he'd figured out Garrad Bramston wasn't to be messed with. He grinned to himself. Rumour had it Karen Hendril served time for a couple of years, which is why he joined late. Most all the recruits were 16, even though you could still join up to your 20th birthday. Garrad hadn't got along with the man since he started at the training school in the autumn, but he'd never clashed with him, until now. It was almost time for lights out. Garrad made one last trip to the latrines before he bedded down for the night. The days were short at this time of year, and he could barely see as he felt his way along the muddy path. He'd done the route so many times before, he hadn't brought a torch. He could manage in the dark. He finished his business, pulled up his breeches, and closed the door behind him. Someone grabbed him. He tried to yell, but couldn't. A grubby hand was pressed against his straining mouth. He was hauled from his feet, carried away from the block and into the woods that ringed the barracks, far enough away that his screams wouldn't be heard. He was thrown towards the soggy ground, hip cracking against a tree trunk as his legs flapped uselessly in the mud. He couldn't see who'd grabbed him. It was even darker in the forest, but the moon cast a little light. He could just about make out the three men who milled around him, their silhouettes black against the inky sky. The grunting rasp of gathering spit warned his ears too late. He could only grimace as it splattered on his face. His eyes screwed up to spider-like slits. A heavy boot pushed on his chest as he desperately tried to scramble to his feet. Gasping lungs fighting for breath, hands clawing at the leg that held him firm. The first punch was thrown. It collided with his chin, and his head snapped back, his skull hitting a root. A fist found his stomach. He coughed, winded, shamefully cowering as another boot found his thigh. Then another punch struck his shoulder. The pressure on his chest released. He wriggled to his side, cradling his head and lifting his knees to hide his chest. A hardened sole came crashing down. A rib cracked, and pain exploded across his chest. Something smashed into his nose. Salty iron dribbled down his throat. He coughed. He spluttered. He gasped for breath. He tried to rise. He couldn't. Someone held him down. He found his voice. He yelled out. The hits kept coming. He heard footsteps. Someone was running his way. The attack paused. "Corporal Goodwin sends his regards," a raspy voice muttered into his ear. A fist found his cheekbone. Everything went quiet. Okay, so that's the end of my second chapter. I hope you enjoyed it. As mentioned at the start of this video, you can get all my chapters on my YouTube channel, The Gallantrian Legacy. And if you want to find out anything else about my channel, my books, or myself, or anything at all, please check out my website, which is charlottegoodwin.co.uk. Thanks for listening. Bye.